Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar to be given by Professor Barak Kushner. Barak got his PhD in history in 2002 from Princeton University, and he's currently a university reader in Japanese history at Cambridge University. In broad terms, his research interests can be said to revolve around modern Japan, modern China, Sino-Japan relations, propaganda, media, Cold War, East Asia, and war crimes trials. Now, more specifically, Barak Kushner's work primarily focuses on 19th to 21st century Sino-Japanese relations and how modern Japan emerged from its historical interaction with the rest of East Asia. His current project is on the construction of justice in post-war East Asia. It is worth mentioning that Barak Kushner has also lived in Japan on and off for about 7 years at least, and has also spent time teaching and studying in mainland China and Taiwan. He has taught English in Japan, he has lived in a Buddhist temple, and studied Japanese. Now, scientifically, among other works, Kushner has published 3 monographs: Men to Devils, Devils to Men, Japanese War Crimes and Chinese Justice. And this monograph was published by Harvard University Press in 2015. This book was also the winner of the American Historical Association's 2016 John K. Fairbank Prize. A second monograph is entitled Slurp, A Social and Culinary History of Ramen, Japan's Favorite Noodle Soup. And this one has been translated into traditional Chinese and into Japanese, and I also believe a version in simplified Chinese has appeared. And this book was originally published in 2012 by Brill. A third monograph of his is entitled The Thought War, Japanese Imperial Propaganda, and this was published by University of Hawaii Press in 2006, and this has also been translated into Japanese. Barak Kushner has also written a number of very interesting articles, and I'd just like to mention one of these. Treacherous Allies, the Cold War in East Asia and American Post-War Anxiety. A very intriguing title, and this was published in Journal of Contemporary History in 2010. Now, Kushner makes use of his time at the Collegium to work on a new monograph concerning the construction of justice in post-war East Asia, examining how the end of Japan's empire affected the new international order. So please welcome Barak.
Get all my tools up to the table here. Thanks for the introduction, Christina. Am I standing close enough to the microphone that everyone can hear me? I'm oftentimes told not to use a microphone because my voice is too loud, so I'll try and modulate it today. It's a real honor to be here today. First of all, to have the opportunity to do the research and have the time to study here at the Collegium, but also to be invited to be able to give this lecture in the Thunberg Lecture Hall, constructed in part from the great legacy of Linnaeus himself and one of his students, Carl Peter Thunberg, who of course gained part of his reputation from having traveled to Japan during the Tokugawa era. So as a Japan historian, to be able to stand amidst this history and talk to you about East Asian history is a real pleasure. And it's also a pleasure to be able to do this in front of Professor Skunka, if I'm going to, hopefully didn't kill your name too much, who really wrote one of the definitive books on Thunberg, and also demonstrating the deep links between Sweden and Japan. So I feel proud to be able to talk to you more about links between Europe and East Asia. Recently, while I was working on this talk, I've been reflecting on the field that I've been in for the past 2 decades, starting from when I was a graduate student. Initially, because I liked languages and I liked talking both just in general and to people and with people, I thought I wanted to be an interpreter. And at that time, about 25 years ago, if you wanted to be an interpreter, the military was a good way for you to practice that profession. Those of you who know me quickly realized that I probably would have received the speediest court-martial conviction, and I too came to understand that would probably be the case, so I never entered the military. I also realized that I didn't really want to be the one interpreting for others, I wanted to be the one talking. I'm not sure, actually, I've reached that stage in life, because as an historian, we all end up really talking for or about other people. And in this case, in my talk today, I'm trying to bridge that dialogue between China and Japan, somewhat Taiwan, although because of time constraints, I won't be able to talk about Taiwan as much. But let me pull away from the personal story and get right into the meat of what I want to talk about. And I have 3 short episodes concerning 3 executions in East Asia at the end of World War II. We should recall, of course, that Japan has been basically in aggressive warfare in East Asia for about a decade and a half, most of that in an undeclared war, but it is controlling virtually most of East Asia and Southeast Asia, almost half of the globe. So episode 1 finds us in Shanghai just after the Japanese surrender. It's a cloudy day in the middle of June 1947. A massive Chinese crowd is surging in Shanghai, looking to get a glimpse of the execution of 2 Japanese imperial officers. They're in a truck that's kind of lazily going around town, and their arms are tied behind them. And it takes them on a sort of tragic parade from the Ward Road jail in central Shanghai to the outskirts of town where they're going to be executed. It was a specific decision by the Chinese nationalist government to execute them outside in what they felt would be a moment of cathartic theater for the masses. They could have done it inside the prison, where an execution chamber was already in place, but they wanted the public to witness the execution. World War II in East Asia had been over for almost 2 years, but the mob in Shanghai wanted blood. The West Australian newspaper on June 19th, 1947, labeled the crowds as, quote, jeering, and wrote that some spat and even threw garbage, straining forward to see the delivery of Chinese capital punishment and yelling as they followed the former Japanese officers to their ends. After both men were shot, Chinese newspapers pressed graphic photos of their executed corpses dripping with blood. This was big news in China, but not really outside of China in East and Southeast Asia, and certainly not really in the West. But there was much more interest internationally for our second vignette. Sorry about that. For our second vignette, the execution of 7 high-level Japanese leaders who were accused of Class A war crimes. I'll get to what that means in a moment. They were held responsible for Japan's aggressive war in Asia, and they met their fate in Sugamo prison in a very different way than the Japanese imperial officers met their ends in China. The execution of these 7 leaders in Tokyo was of such importance that the full Tokyo trial judgment, all 1,200 lengthy and legally cumbersome pages of it, were read in open court. William Sebald, an American officer who was in the court at the time, called it a, quote, wearisome ceremony. Other journalists at the time had less savory comments about the nature of the trial. The actual execution, however, was kept in secret until after it was implemented. And the reason was the Americans were afraid of demonstrations rallying in support of executed Japanese leaders. Sebald, that American officer, was actually present at the executions. And he wrote in his memoirs, all the prisoners were wearing American military clothing that was sizes too big, which helped them all look old, very old, helpless, pitiful, and tragic. The post-war adjudication of wartime responsibility didn't see all Japanese executed, either in public, as in China, or in secret, as in the American executions in Shanghai. Many key figures of Japan's imperial and collaborationist administrations managed to evade capture and punishment altogether. And that brings us to our third episode, which tells us as much about the pursuit or the failure of finding justice at the end of the war as it does about serendipity of being perhaps in the right place at the right time and wearing the right clothing. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, by all accounts, should have been put on trial for Japanese war crimes, or should at least have been arrested. But he wasn't. He was a master spy, and at the moment that the Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, he removes his Japanese imperial military garb, puts on the robes of a Buddhist priest, and goes underground for about 6 years throughout East and Southeast Asia. He pops up in 1950 back in Japan to the applause of many. He writes a bestseller, My 7,000-Mile Underground Escape, and he quickly moves up in Japanese politics as well. He gets elected to the lower house, then he gets elected to the upper house, and the Americans, the occupiers, see him as someone that they can work with. The CIA afterwards changes its mind, however, and writes in a 1955 intelligence report, quote, Tsuji is the type of man who, given the chance, would start World War III without any misgivings. So he wasn't quite the guy they thought he was. He dies later in mysterious circumstances in Vietnam. I start with these three forms of war closure, as I would call them, to offer you a taste of what the end of the beginning was like, how the post-war would unfold. Did it offer a measured sense of justice for participants? Did it offer a secretive form of justice pursued but not revealed, as in Tokyo, or did it demonstrate a failure to bring justice to the victims, as with the last episode, Colonel Tsuji? And you probably notice I try not to use too many East Asian names in a talk like this because it can get a bit cumbersome and difficult for people if they're not specialists to follow. So I've kind of removed all the names for the most part from the talk. If you want to know more about specifics, we can talk about that during the Q&A. Now, when I began this book, or I should say, cheekily, when I applied to the Collegium for this project, I thought I would be writing about the construction of justice in East Asia. I apologize, Christina, that's actually not what I'm able to do. What I have found after, well, I guess kind of slaving away in my loft and thinking and reading and writing and talking with people each and every day and getting slightly larger with the delicious lunches that are served here, as I began to read more and digest the material and look at the cultural products that have come out in East Asia long after the trials have been over, the movies, news articles, the media production, it occurred to me, or it was revealed to me in this research, that there's a yawning divide between the effort to implement justice at that time, in 1945, and for the years that follow, and the emotional baggage on the ground, which clearly demonstrated on all sides that most people believed, and believe now, more in the absence of justice than its arrival. I pondered what this means, and I continue to do so, and this is in part what my talk is about today. Some initial considerations on how can we have had this expensive, laborious path toward trying to attain justice in East Asia, and yet find ourselves more than 7 decades after the end of the war still facing parties that refuse to believe that justice was ever attained. It's the gap among and between the trials and their verdicts that I believe explains how we've arrived at what I label a history of injustice. So I'm really doing a construction of the history of injustice in East Asia, or the belief that injustice is what has occurred. And in some ways, therefore, I think my topic I've stood my own topic on its head. I'm going to contrast this with the idea or the belief of the Nuremberg trial. If we think about the history of the Nuremberg trial in Germany and the mountains of accolades that are piled on top of it as having been the trial of the century, of having found and attained justice for the victims of the Holocaust and others in Europe, and helped reintegrate Germany back into Europe, the same sort of trials, following the same international logic and international law, produced a very different set of results in East Asia. How can that be? What sort of beliefs did the trials birth to get to this point? For many Japanese, it's the emotional response that has developed in this manner toward the trials. And I'll talk about this as I move forward as well, but years after the war was over, several sections within the Ministry of Justice in Japan conducted a set of interviews with former military leaders who had been placed on trial. And one of those was General Araki. And I quote him in the title of my talk. When asked what was his response to his own personal war crimes trial, he said, "It was a drunken charade." It's a direct quote. And the reason he says that is because he felt that the interpretation at his trial was substandard, that he had to go get a dictionary, bring it to his trial, and frequently interrupt the interpreter who he felt was kind of damaging his testimony in words, an incorrect translation, and redo it. And he felt the interpreter was not up to snuff, his legal understanding wasn't correct, and therefore the war trial, but also all the war crimes trials, were therefore not indicative of actually finding justice. I realize I placed my water too far away. On the Chinese side, what we have perhaps reflects what we see recently in America between North and South. In some ways, Northerners in America are astounded that Southerners can still talk about the Civil War in America in terms of justice or righteousness, or in terms of something like states' rights or whatnot. And there's a historian in America called Gary Gallagher who writes that even though the Civil War almost brought America's own legacy to its knees, white Southerners, quote, thoroughly beaten, but largely feel unrepentant. And it struck me that this sentence is very similar to the relationship perhaps nowadays between kind of high-ranking Japanese officials and Chinese officials, that Chinese officials are incredulous that the Japanese cannot see World War II in any other way than the Chinese see it, and vice versa. The question is, how do we arrive at this point? And I say you can't just look at the trials themselves. We need to look at the legacy of how the trials were lived after they concluded, long after the verdicts were handed down. In order to do that, I feel that we need to think once again or reconsider our analysis of the trials. We tend to think of war crimes trials in the late 20th and early 21st century as the means to transitional justice. But transitional justice is really just a term for what happens within one country when it moves from, let's say, being a dictatorship or being kind of one-party authoritarian rule to a democracy. What transitional justice fails to take into theoretical consideration is that it can't deal with a region. It can't deal with a hemisphere. So I propose we think about this in terms of competition, competitive justice. how else to understand the world when looking at decolonization and de-imperialization. What happens after World War II in East and Southeast Asia? All the European colonial powers come back in. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to prove that they are legitimate or the legitimate owners of authority after having lost to the Japanese previously in World War II. What better way to do that, or what they have to do, because other countries are doing it, is they have to hold war crimes trials of the Japanese. First the Americans do it, well then the British have to, because they have to show that they're back in power and they're legitimate and they understand international law. The French, they really don't want to, but then they have to do it in Vietnam. And that's a double problem because they don't really relinquish authority to the Japanese until 1944. The Chinese, of course, they're one of the major allies. They need to do it as well. And what we begin to see when we look at all of the trials in the aggregate, both A, B, and C class trials, is that it becomes a competition to show who understands justice and who understands the way to bring real truth to power at the end of the war. Just to remind you, you can kind of look at the slide. There are three major types of war crimes trials that are pursued at the end of World War II in East Asia: A, B, and C. There was a joke at the end of the war that one of the war criminals said, "Oh, it's great, I'm an A-class war criminal. It means I'm much better." And they said, no, actually, that's the worst ranking. But there's really not kind of a hierarchy of best to worst. It is A-class was a new set of ideas that leaders who hadn't actually sullied their hands with physical crimes on the ground could be pursued for having brought their nation to an aggressive war. So it's really the people responsible for policies that bring a country to a war. B class were your conventional war crimes, and C was an entire new category also created specifically for Nazi war crimes, crimes against humanity, and that would have been the crime of genocide as it came to be later known. These trials start 1945. Of course, the Tokyo War Crimes trial ends first, but then it's important to remember that there are war crimes trials all over the empire. The Tokyo trial you may have heard of, has a small number. It was only 28 defendants. But there are 5,700 other defendants around East and Southeast Asia. And if you look at the map, you get a visual idea of the scope of the extent to which different countries are competing around Southeast and East Asia to find justice, bring it to courts about Japanese war crimes that were produced in their area. And the courts and the venues follow the very contour of the Japanese empire around its fringes. But of course, importantly, it's not just the Tokyo trial and then the BC class trial in 50 venues. There are even more war crimes trials after that. They continue up until 1956 in the People's Republic of China. Those are war crimes trials held by the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. And then there are a sort of set of trials, again by the Chinese Communists, of Chinese nationalists, right? Chiang Kai-shek's group that fled China in 1949 and took the Chinese nationalists to Taiwan. So initially, while we spent time in scholarship talking about the Tokyo War Crimes trials, Tokyo War Crimes trial, there's just one. Very few scholars have looked at the long durée of these trials. And because they continue for so long, with each individual party competing with the past and the present centers of power to demonstrate that it understands the full extent of how to bring true justice to the war, unless we do that, we can't really understand where we are today. And it's in the public sphere of the media and popular culture that this conversation about justice received or denied never abates and continues until the present day. Sorry, it's actually very cold in here, so my nose is beginning to run. Normally, I carry a handkerchief to wipe my brow when I'm talking, or I'll take off my jacket because I get warm, but that's not happening today. which I guess is good. It gives us a real taste of what it must have been like in the 18th century to give, or early 1800s to give a talk in such a room. East Asian authorities' persistent attention to the problem demonstrates the importance the Allies, former colonial subjects in East Asia, and the Japanese themselves all attributed to being able to define the meaning of World War II. And here's something that we often forget. The war crimes trials themselves are about bringing a legal measure of justice to Japanese war crimes in the former empire. But the memory of the trials, the record of the trials, is what gets reproduced within society, within media, within historical circles, and that becomes the narrative of the war. So there's not only competition at the time of the trials themselves for who is producing or who is able to implement the best justice, then there becomes competition over the records themselves, because using those records, or history will be based on those who have access to those records and who can write the story of what the war in Japan's empire was all about. So for me, it's important that we look at the Nuremberg trials in Germany, the Tokyo trials in Japan, the BC class trials all around East and Southeast Asia, to consider their interrelatedness, the longue durée impact this had on the region, the deep geographical and temporal connections, and also the staff who are moving back and forth between the trials as well. I now we're going to comment a bit on the major war crimes trials completed by the Chinese nationalists, or the KMT. Then I'll talk briefly about the trials by the Chinese communists, the CCP, why they're different, how they're similar, and then I'll move forward. So the KMT trials, the Chinese nationalist trials, take place basically between 1946 and 1949, and the KMT aim is to demonstrate internationally, but also to Chinese citizens, that KMT power is back. The KMT are the legitimate ruling authority of China, and that they understand international law. You'll look at the table behind me, and you'll note that the Chinese let a lot of Japanese off. They find a lot of Japanese not guilty. Chiang Kai-shek had early on set a policy during the war to be benevolent and kind and try and re-educate Japanese prisoners of war, and they kept the same policy going in the post-war. Is this coming in and out, or is it? Sorry. Chiang Kai-shek's policy, the leader of the KMT, was to, as he says, repay Japanese malevolence with Chinese benevolence. They were going to, in a sense, turn the other cheek, and they were going to quickly try and rebuild their relationship with the Japanese. And in part, they do this by trying to have justice light. They're going to go after the biggest war criminals they can find, but they're not going to go after everybody, and they're not going to pursue them unnecessarily. It's a pragmatic policy. The Chinese need to regain trade with Japan as soon as possible, but it's also a policy that demonstrates what's happening behind this, quote, pursuit for justice. It's about justice, but it's also about justice against a particular group. And when the war is over, when the Japanese surrender in 1945, what the Japanese former imperial army finds is that their greatest enemy is no longer the KMT. It is the shared enemy between the KMT and the Japanese, and that is the Chinese communists. So for the KMT, for the Chinese nationalists, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now the Japanese are their friend, and the Chinese communists are their enemy. And they're more interested in pursuing a war against the Chinese communists in the Civil War than they are about spending precious effort and money in Japanese war crimes trials against the Japanese. Now that sounds all good and well-meaning, but there are some problems in there as well. In the pursuit of war crimes against the Japanese, there are also many KMT war crimes trials that fall far short of international standards. One egregious example would be the 100-man killing contest trial. Essentially, it's a trial against two Japanese officers who are accused of a carnival-esque episode as the Japanese imperial military approached Nanjing in December of 1937. Japanese newspapers at the time wrote that these two men had a competition to see who could cut off more heads of the Chinese on the Japanese military approach to Nanjing. It was indicative of Japanese propaganda at the time. Obviously, the tone and the grotesque nature of it make it seem like a heinous crime, but it's probably not true. Japanese wartime newspapers were well known for this type of propaganda, oftentimes creating a larger episode out of nothing or a larger atrocity than perhaps what occurred. Now, be careful. I'm not saying the Japanese didn't commit atrocities. What I'm saying is that the evidence on which this trial was based was probably less than satisfactory. Nonetheless, the trial went through, and because it was a trial within the general paradigm of post-war BC class war crimes conducted by the Allies, it becomes ironclad proof. Right? Proof, as they say in Chinese there, as much as a mountain. So piled so high you cannot refute it. And yet we should refute it. Or if we want to take war crimes trials seriously, we need to dig in a bit more. But here's the problem. If we try and unravel the threads of such an extremely charged trial about Japanese imperial brutality, do we end up denying atrocities? Or will we be seen as revisionists? How do we deal with trials that subvert justice, even if their intention was lawful? Now, I'll talk about this toward the end of the talk as well, but this trial lives on. In the 21st century, the descendants of the Japanese imperial officer sued several publishers and media companies in Japan for defamation of character. So these are not arguments that were adjudicated and then dealt with only in the immediate post-war. The memory of these trials lingers on and feeds political friction on both sides. Then there's a hiatus in China for about 6 years, until 1956. And 1956 will once again see Japanese war crimes trials rise to the forefront of media and political attention in China, with another set of war crimes trials against Japanese officials and former officers. You're probably asking yourself, well, wait a second, how is that possible? I know that in 1949, the Chinese nationalists repatriated all the Japanese war criminals. The Chinese nationalists didn't want the Chinese communists to be able to get their hands on any Japanese war criminals and retry them in a socialist court as a way of subverting all the effort that the KMT had given internationally to demonstrate that it understood justice. So there are no more Japanese prisoners, theoretically, in China. And yet, in December of 1949 and early 1950, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, takes a long train ride to Moscow, and there in Moscow, he's given an opportunity. And it's the Soviet foreign minister, Vyshinsky, who says, Mao, I have a present for you. I have 1,000 carefully handpicked Japanese war criminals waiting for you to do something with. And according to records that have been recently released, they were released about 6-7 years ago, Mao says, no, thank you, we're really busy reconstructing our entire legal framework. We are building a socialist legal framework, but we haven't built it yet. So thanks for the offer, but no. And Vyshinsky comes back and says, it's not really an offer you can refuse. It doesn't threaten him physically, but, they keeps pushing it. And finally, Mao, back in correspondence with others, said, okay, we'll take them on. But the Japanese initially have no idea what they're going to do with these, the Chinese have no idea what they're going to do with these Japanese prisoners. They're going to kill them? Maybe. They're going to put them on trial? With what? Right? Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party have thrown out all Chinese nationalist law. They have nothing. They're rebuilding. the first Minister of Justice, Shi Liang, she gets together a group of Chinese legal scholars in the early to mid 1950s, goes to the Soviet Union to study Soviet law so that they can bring back the apparatus of socialist law to China so that they will have some forum in which to do something with these prisoners. So for the first couple years, nothing happens. Then the Chinese start to investigate very carefully, and their policy is very different than the Chinese nationalists. The Chinese communists want the Japanese to admit their guilt in public. It's not about the process of law. It's not about the process of justice. It's about demonstrating its results to the people, an admission of guilt. And that takes a long time. You have to re-educate. You have to reorient. You have to pester. You have to wear down. And so they do. And that's precisely what happens. It's why the trials of the Chinese communists don't get underway until the summer of 1956, 6 years after these Japanese prisoners were initially handed over from the Soviet Union to China. Now, initially, I had thought that this was only a Chinese idea, because I was reading mostly the Chinese archives and looking at this point. But over the last few months, I've come to realize that perhaps part of the impetus for the great strategy that the Chinese communists took towards the Japanese prisoners was because of all of the new missions leaving Japan, going to China, and struggling to reorient the two countries on a path toward reestablishing diplomacy. We should remember, of course, that Japan is occupied from 1945 until 1952. It establishes peace and diplomatic relations with about less than 50 nations. 1952 with Taiwan, 1965 with South Korea, 1972, but formally 78 with People's Republic of China or Communist China. So in the mid-1950s, it has no official relations with China, and it desperately wants it. Japan does. The Americans don't want the Japanese to have official relations. They're afraid of this kind of rebirth of Japanese power or a Japan economic bloc in East Asia. And you get all these missions going from Japan to China and talking. And when you look at some of the papers of these discussions, it's very interesting. Mao says to one of the interlocutors on the Japanese side, get more former Japanese military men to come over to China and talk with us. And the Japanese side says, you mean the communists, the Japanese Communist Party? And Mao goes, no, I don't mean the Japanese Communist Party. We already have relations with them. I want people to come to China who I don't agree with. And that's former Japanese military officers. And it does start for a bit of time. Former Japanese military officers going over to Japan. And they have deep conversation about what's happening to the Japanese prisoners. At one point, they're told the Chinese are waiting until emotions on the mainland simmer down in order to hold the public trials of the Japanese war criminals. I'm not sure that's the case. It probably is in part. It's also quite clear that the Chinese didn't always know what they wanted to do. But what's interesting is this back and forth dialogue or demonstration of interest from Japan, and this pushes or galvanizes the Chinese to think about the way in which they're going to implement their own trials. So they execute no one. They release or they pardon 960 individuals in a demonstration of justice that's more just and more benevolent than any other party in East or Southeast Asia. Those 960 go back, and they have a big impact on Japan because they form a lobbying group called Chukiren, or the Association of Those Who've Returned from China. And they keep what they feel are the worst war criminals, 45 of them, and they put them on trial. But again, they execute no one. Now, seemingly, the story should stop there. The Japanese are all done with. They've all had justice found for them or on them or adjudicated their crimes. But that's not the end of the story, because the Japanese are not the only, quote, war criminals in China at this point. There's still the issue of what happened during China's civil war. And that gets kind of put into the mix as we move into the 1960s and the 1970s. And I've titled this part in my paper, Enemies Even Worse Than the Imperial Japanese. Because when you read back the newspapers of the Chinese communists at the moment of the Civil War and kind of when it's finished and slightly after, the Japanese are there in the background, but the number one war criminal, it's Chiang Kai-shek. It's the Chinese nationalists. Let's not forget that after 1949, it was not a fait accompli that the communists would be able to establish a new state. They had years of anti-counter-revolutionary movements, years of finding landlords unjust and summarily executing them. And so you have to think, why did the Chinese spend so much time being benevolent to the Japanese, but not so benevolent to their own Chinese? And the story continues until the 1970s. And it's kind of awkward that in the early 1970s, Zhou Enlai, who's Mao's premier, writes a memo to Mao, and he says, you know, there are guys languishing up in Fushun prison in Liaoning province in the northeast. This is where the Japanese had been housed until 1964, when the last of them are repatriated to Japan. And this is the early 1970s, and Zhou writes to Mao, you do know we have people up there. Mao is entering kind of the sunset of his life. He's not doing well physically. He's starting to garble his words. His vision is not good. In a couple years, he'll need personal kind of interpreters because no one can understand him. Mao writes back, what are you talking about? And Zhou says, we've forgotten in the midst of the Cultural Revolution that there are KMT war criminals, same term, in Fushun prison. It would look bad, he says. And Mao writes, people will say that, quote, great war criminals, like the Japanese, are granted amnesty, while the smaller war criminals are jailed until they die. Foreign war criminals are released, but we incarcerate our own war criminals. Mao responds quickly and he says, basically do what you need to do, change their labor schedule, give them better food to eat, do something, quote, figure out some way to make it so they survive. This was going to be a media fiasco. It took years. Many died in the interim. And finally, by 1975, the last of the KMT war criminals are released, 11 years after the Japanese war criminals are fully and finally released. A few of these, 10 of these last KMT war criminals wanted to return to Taiwan. I say return to Taiwan because that's the term used in Chinese. Of course, they're not returning to Taiwan. They've never been to Taiwan, but they want to go where the KMT is in power. And at first, the KMT, it's no longer headed by Chiang Kai-shek. It's headed by his son, Jiang Jingguo, or I guess in Pinyin it would be Cheng Jin-kuo. I can never do his name correctly. And then he says no, because there's a turnover of power and they're worried that these 10 will become propaganda tools for the Chinese communists. And again, one would think, okay, well then the story really is over there, but it's not. Because in 1980, we begin to see kind of the full return of the impact of the idea of justice in East Asia at the trial of the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four were the four major, what were called accomplices of Mao, who were held responsible for the Cultural Revolution in China. Now, the Ministry of Justice in China had been shut in 1959 because law was considered bourgeois, and it wasn't resurrected until 1980. And this is the first major trial, really using socialist law with Western trappings to do what? To once again prove justice, to prove that the CCP is back, it's in power, and it understands how to right the wrong situation of the Cultural Revolution. But if you look closely, what you'll notice is the visuality of the trial of the Gang of Four is based on the Tokyo War Crimes trial. Because one of the individuals who was brought in as a consultant who went by the name of Henry Cho, his English name, had worked at the Tokyo war crimes trial and other trials at that time. He chooses the curtains, he chooses the setup, he chooses the color scheme. He based much of his settings on his experience from the Tokyo trial because he believed, quote, that trial venue had created the definitive atmosphere of legality for the proper pursuit of justice. One of the issues that we need to discuss when talking about the memory of war crimes trials is who's in the seat of power that guides this memory, or that releases archives, or that talks about these issues in public. And I thought it's very telling to think about wartime and post-war Japanese officialdom, the bureaucracy. Because in some ways, from 1940 almost to the 1970s, it's the same guys in power. Sure, some are purged, but most come back. And most of them retain some imperial patina of their former belief about empire. And I think one of the more telling quotes that one can dig up in memoirs and whatnot is from former Prime Minister from Japan, 1957 to 1960, Prime Minister Kishi. And Kishi writes in a set of memoirs about Manchukuo, Japan's puppet kingdom during World War II. And he recalls his post-1957 trip to Southeast Asia when he's writing this recollection in the 1970s. And I think once you hear the quote, you'll understand where I'm going. He says, on the numerous occasions when I made state visits to the various countries of Southeast Asia, I recalled Manchukuo. At the time, Asia was in the throes of its economic resurgence, and this reminded me of how we built the ideal and racially harmonious country of Manchukuo. You can almost hear the kind of music coming in the background. So many young Japanese, filled with idealism, crossed the sea to prepare and take a stand against the West in the boundless and plentiful material treasure house of Manchukuo. Afterward, the facilities, infrastructure, technology, and manpower they left behind lives on within the Chinese economy. Japan's destiny in the future is, of course, unchanged from before and remains united with Asia's economic regeneration. To accomplish this feat, the experience and reflection on what was done prior in Manchukuo can serve as a most valuable reference guide. Now, of course, what Kishi fails to mention is the war are all the comfort women stations that dot the landscape around Japan's empire. All of the negative aspects of empire are, in a sense, unrooted from his nostalgic memory. And in part, this is the memory that has in some ways made it to modern Japan, or the leadership in contemporary Japan. Such remarks historically and in the present don't fall on deaf ears. The current prime minister has said that Japanese war criminals who were executed, particularly the former leaders, quote, formed the foundation of this nation. The owner of a popular hotel chain in Japan, Appa, produced a right-wing book that denied the Nanjing massacre, and it emphasized this message by, until recently, placing a copy of this book in every nightstand of each room in every one of its 400 hotels. International backlash forced the hotel chain to remove the book from all the stands, but it's still on sale at the counter in the front of the hotel, the check-in counter. In 2013, the Chinese Communist Central Committee circulated a communiqué on the state of the ideological sphere. And it's essentially a secret document that says or affirms the correctness of historical views held by the party. And it talks about pushing the media and Chinese citizens to toe the ideological line. Essentially what it says is you can't have your own opinions about history. Whatever the party comes up with is correct history. And here is, in a sense, perhaps the result of the evolution of the 7 decades from the end of the war crimes trials to the present. If and when the Japanese, or anyone else for that matter, question any aspect of war crimes trial history, for example, the 100-man killing contest, they're automatically casting themselves in an anti-Chinese, anti-PRC light. Now, what we also notice, and you can see visually here on the slide, is that there's been a change in the way in which Chinese history is interpreted domestically. I used to talk about humiliation, the century of humiliation against which it had to pit itself and demonstrate why the CCP was the most legitimate authority in China now. Now it is trying to make the connection with justice, and in doing so, it is trying to link Chinese history with Holocaust history. Trying to demonstrate, you can see the book in the middle is China's Auschwitz. It's actually a book about a prisoner of war camp in Taiyuan, but the title says Chinese Auschwitz, which of course I feel is grossly misleading and overdoes the tenuous connections between Japanese atrocities and Nazi atrocities. I don't think we should be mixing the two. I think in that sense we do need to talk about them separately. When you visit the Nanjing Civilian War of Resistance Museum against Japan at the outskirts of Nanjing, the haunting soundtrack from the film Schindler's List plays in the theater, even though Nanjing has nothing to do with the Holocaust. There's been I'm sorry, it's kind of a squished photo. I look sort of like a dumpling or something there in this photo. There's been an explosion of museums now that deal with war crimes trials, or war crimes history around China. Now that the topic has resurfaced again, now that it is linked to the national push for the discussion of justice, all these venues that had been pretty much abandoned for decades are reformed, rebuilt, and colorfully decorated. They're not wrong. I'm not saying the Chinese have no right to do this. I'm not saying inside, even though there's some hyperbole about the CCP bringing the most justice to post-war war crimes trials, they're not incorrect. But I do think we have to think about what happened in the interim until the 21st century, and why now all of a sudden these museums are coming out to really get at the heart of the situation. And this is the case with Comfort Women Museum in the center of Nanjing. When I was first there a while ago, in 2008, this was a derelict part of the center of town. In 2014, it is an enormous, almost city block, fairly well done, minimum of emotional opprobrium toward the Japanese Museum of Comfort Women. Virtually empty, however. So this brings me to, what does it all mean and where am I? I feel the task is to delve into the trials and their legacies, and to compose a story of how this history took a backseat to politics, but how it has remained central to the idea of competing for owning how justice is and was perceived since the downfall of the Japanese Empire 70 years ago. To really understand the post-war regionally in East Asia, we can't rely on domestic histories of each country. We need to look at transnational, a regional idea for what these trials meant all over, across borders, and how to investigate the legacy that has left a deep and lasting impact on contemporary politics. I don't think we've missed the historical record of Japanese atrocities, but I do agree with the Yale scholar Timothy Snyder and his assessment that previously destruction in Central and Eastern Europe during World War II was relatively unknown because it was divided up into nationalistic parts. Because one section was, let's say, in Hungary, one section was in Bulgaria, unless you were a Bulgarian historian, well, you wouldn't necessarily look at the Romanian parts and vice versa. No one was looking regionally, and therefore a whole element of the history was lost. We've done the same thing with war crimes trials. There are specialists of Singapore war crimes trials, of British war crimes trials, of Hong Kong war crimes trials. And so each part of the atrocities of the Japanese Empire gets divvied up according to nation, no one looks at them holistically to then think about what has the impact been on East Asia as a whole. In addition, as many other scholars have said, I think we rely too much on the American point of view. And I have the quote behind me that I think really brings home this idea of what happens if we rely too much on the American point of view. We have a certain view of World War II, and that view colors how we interpret the post-war history as well. And this brings me to my final slide, which I call the Lost Changs. If you look carefully at the photo, they all look kind of, they don't know what they're doing. They're all facing different directions. Some are smiling, some are leaning, some are moving up and down. This is a park just outside of Taipei on the way to Taoyuan International Airport in Taiwan. And these were where all the Chang statues were moved after the end of military law and the establishment of democracy in Taiwan. Until the end of military law, it was a cult of personality state, and every school had to have a statue of Chiang Kai-shek in front of it. Once it became a democracy, well, you could believe in any leader or not, and they removed them from the schools, and they didn't want to throw them away. That seemed a bit too sacrilegious, so they moved most of them, at least the ones in the north, to what I call the Park of the Lost Changs. But to me, really, this garden signifies something else, and maybe I'm alluding to the fact that perhaps we'll see a garden of lost Maos in the future. I don't think we're going to see a garden of lost CCP leaders. I'm not arguing and I'm not touting, I'm not up here saying, well, until the CCP ends its reign in China, history won't change. I don't think that's possible, and B, I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think that once the cult of personality is removed, or until the politics of the nation can be divorced from opinions about history, reconciliation in East Asia will remain elusive. And I will end there. Thank you very much.